She didn't come to therapy because she was overwhelmed. She came because she wasn't. For a long time, she had assumed that people usually came to therapy when life became too intense, when emotions felt too big, when anxiety, sadness, or stress started taking over daily life. But that wasn't what had brought her there. In fact, the problem seemed to be the opposite. Nothing seemed to touch her anymore. Not good news, not bad news. Events that once felt important now moved through her life quietly, almost like background noise. A promotion at work happened. She noticed it, but the excitement that she expected to feel never really arrived. A difficult conversation with a friend took place. She understood the situation logically, but the emotional reaction that normally followed something like that simply didn't appear. Life kept happening, but the feelings that usually accompanied it seemed strangely distant. She tried to explain it carefully. "I know things should affect me," she said, "but it's like I'm watching my life from the outside." She wasn't depressed in the way people usually imagine. She still got up every morning. She completed her responsibilities. She maintained relationships. She laughed when something was funny. But even those reactions felt slightly mechanical, like they were happening automatically, not because something inside her was deeply moved. She didn't feel broken. She didn't feel devastated. If anything, the experience was much quieter than that. She felt distant from events, from people, sometimes even from herself. Imagine sitting in a room where everyone else seems fully present in the moment. They react naturally. They laugh loudly. Yet they feel disappointment, excitement, and frustration. But you feel like there is a thin layer of glass between you and everything else. You can see everything clearly. You understand what is happening. But the experience doesn't quite reach you the same way. That was the closest description she could find. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't painful. It was simply muted. And for a long time, she had wondered something quietly. Was this just how adulthood felt? Had something inside her simply settled down with age? Or had something else changed without her realizing it? Because the truth was, there had been a time when she felt things deeply. Moments of happiness used to feel warm and vivid. Difficult moments used to bring strong reactions. Music could move her. Conversations could stay in her mind for hours. Now, that those same experiences passed through her day gently, almost lightly, leaving very little behind. And the strange part was this. From the outside, nothing in her life suggested that something was wrong, which made the feeling even harder to explain. Because when everything appears stable, it becomes difficult to understand why something inside feels so different. Part 1. When life starts to feel flat, Anna was 37. Her life, by most standards, looked stable. She worked full-time. She maintained friendships. She handled daily responsibilities without difficulty. Her schedule looked like that of many adults balancing work, relationships, and personal obligations. From the outside, nothing about her situation suggested that something unusual was happening. She showed up on time. She completed tasks. And she responded to messages. She stayed connected to the people around her. If someone had looked at her life from a distance, they might have assumed she was doing well, and in many ways she was. But internally, something had quietly shifted. The change had not happened suddenly. There had been no dramatic moment when everything felt different overnight. Instead, the shift had occurred gradually. So gradually, in fact, that she hadn't noticed it immediately. At first, it appeared in small ways. Moments that once brought joy started to feel slightly less vivid. A favorite song still sounded pleasant, but it didn't create the same emotional reaction it once had. Meeting friends still felt enjoyable, but the warmth that usually stayed with her afterward faded more quickly. She didn't stop appreciating things, but the emotional intensity seemed lower, as if someone had quietly turned down the volume. At the same time, difficult situations also seemed less intense. Arguments that might once have left her upset for hours now passed quickly. Stressful moments at work still required attention, but they didn't create the same emotional pressure she used to feel. At first, she thought this might actually be a positive change. Maybe she had simply become more balanced, more emotionally stable. After all, many people spend years trying to become less reactive, less overwhelmed, less emotionally affected by every small situation. So for a while, she assumed this was a sign of maturity. Maybe she had simply learned to stay calm. Maybe life experience had helped her develop emotional control. But as time passed, something about that explanation stopped feeling convincing, because calmness usually brings clarity. When someone feels calm, they are still present with their emotions. They simply experience them without being overwhelmed. What Anna felt was different. Her experience wasn't calm, it was flat. The difference between those two states is subtle, but important. Calmness still contains emotional color. You can still feel happiness, sadness, affection, and excitement. But those feelings arrive in a steady and manageable way. Flatness, on the other hand, removes the color entirely. Moments still occur. Events still matter logically. But the emotional texture becomes softer, thinner, less detailed. Anna began noticing this during ordinary moments. A friend shared exciting news. She smiled. She congratulated them. But inside, the reaction felt strangely distant. Not fake, just faint. Another time, she watched a film that normally would have made her emotional. The story was moving. The acting was powerful. She understood why the scene was meant to create strong feelings. But the emotional reaction she expected never fully arrived. She could recognize the moment intellectually, but she didn't experience it in the same way. It felt as if something inside her had stepped slightly backward, not disappearing completely, just creating distance. And the longer this continued, the more she started asking herself a quiet question. When did everything become so quiet? Because life hadn't stopped happening. Moments of connection still existed. Important events still occurred. People around her still experienced strong emotions. But her own inner experience had slowly shifted. Not into pain, not into sadness, just into something softer, something quieter, something that felt reduced. At first, she tried to ignore it. After all, nothing seemed obviously wrong. But over time, she started to realize that the absence of strong emotion can sometimes be just as confusing as having too much of it. Because emotions are one of the ways people experience meaning. They give color to moments. They help certain experiences stay in memory. They create the feeling of being fully present in life. And when that emotional intensity becomes quieter, life can begin to feel slightly distant, even when everything on the surface appears completely normal. Part 2. The difference between calm and disconnection. At first, Anna tried to understand the change in the most logical way possible. Maybe nothing was wrong. Maybe this was simply what adulthood felt like. When people are younger, emotions often appear quickly and strongly. Excitement can be intense. Disappointment can feel overwhelming. Even small experiences sometimes seem incredibly important. But as people grow older, emotional reactions often become more balanced. Life experience teaches the mind how to regulate intensity. So Anna wondered if this new feeling was simply maturity. Maybe she had become more stable, more balanced, less reactive. At first, that explanation sounded reasonable. After all, many people spend years learning how to manage emotions more calmly. They learn how to pause before reacting. They learn how to handle stressful situations without becoming overwhelmed. And they learn how to stay steady even when life becomes complicated. So perhaps what she was experiencing was simply emotional growth. But the more she paid attention, the more she noticed something that didn't quite fit that idea. Because calmness usually comes with clarity. When someone feels calm, their emotions are still present. They still feel happiness when something good happens. They still feel sadness when something difficult occurs. But those feelings arrive in a manageable way. They rise, they move through the body, and then they settle. Calmness doesn't remove emotion. It simply keeps emotion from becoming overwhelming. What Anna was experiencing felt different. She struggled to find the right words for it. Eventually, she described it this way: being present, but slightly far away. She could see what was happening around her, and she could understand situations clearly. She could respond in appropriate ways. But the emotional connection to those moments felt weaker, almost like watching something happen through glass. You can still see everything, you understand the scene perfectly, but you're not fully inside it. That thin distance changes the experience, and that's exactly how she described her days. She wasn't numb in the dramatic way people sometimes imagine. She didn't feel empty. She still cared about people. She still appreciated positive moments. But those feelings rarely became strong. They stayed at a lower intensity, a softer level. Imagine listening to music through headphones where the volume is turned down very, very low. You can still hear the song. You can recognize the melody, but the richness of the sound disappears. The bass is softer, and the details are harder to notice. The emotional impact becomes smaller. That was the closest comparison she could find. Life was still playing, but the volume felt reduced. She began noticing this difference during conversations with friends. Someone might share an exciting story. Everyone around the table reacts naturally. Laughter appears quickly. Energy fills the room, and Anna participates in the moment. She listens, she smiles, she responds. But internally, something feels slightly delayed, like her emotional system is running on a slower setting. The reaction eventually appears, but it never reaches the same intensity she remembers from earlier years. For a long time, she didn't mention this to anyone, because explaining it felt strangely difficult. After all, most people talk about emotions when they feel too much. Too much anxiety, too much sadness, too much stress. But what words do you use when the problem is feeling less? When life becomes quieter in a way that is hard to describe? And perhaps the most confusing part was this. Nothing in her life suggested that she should feel disconnected. There had been no recent crisis, no dramatic loss, no obvious emotional shock. Everything seemed stable, which made the distance she felt even more puzzling. Because when life appears calm on the outside, it becomes harder to understand why something inside feels so far away. Part 3. When the mind reduces intensity. Emotional numbing is often misunderstood. When people hear the phrase, they sometimes imagine a complete absence of feeling. They imagine someone who no longer experiences emotion at all. But in reality, the experience is usually more subtle than that. Most of the time, emotional numbing doesn't eliminate emotions. It simply reduces their intensity. Instead of disappearing entirely, emotions become softer, less powerful, less immediate, and this change often happens for a reason. The human mind is constantly adjusting itself to protect stability. When emotional intensity becomes overwhelming for long periods of time, the brain begins looking for ways to reduce that pressure. One way it does this is by lowering emotional amplitude. In simple terms, the system turns down the volume. Strong reactions become smaller. Stress becomes more manageable. Overwhelm becomes less likely. From the brain's perspective, this is not a mistake. It's a strategy, a protective adjustment, and very often, this adjustment appears after periods of life when emotions felt too intense to handle comfortably. When someone goes through extended stress, constant responsibility, repeated emotional pressure, the mind sometimes learns to regulate emotions earlier in the process, before they fully emerge. Instead of allowing the full emotional reaction to appear, the system gently reduces it. The result is stability. But stability comes with a trade-off, because the same system that reduces painful emotions also reduces positive ones. Excitement becomes softer. Joy becomes quieter. Even meaningful moments can feel less vivid. It's not because the person stopped caring. It's because the mind became very skilled at lowering emotional intensity. And once that pattern develops, it can continue operating long after the original stress has passed. And this is why many people who experience emotional numbing describe something very similar. They say they still understand their emotions logically. They know what they should feel. They know when something is important. But the physical experience of that emotion feels distant, muted, less immediate. Anna didn't know this yet. She simply knew that something about her emotional experience had changed, and she couldn't quite understand when it had started. But as the conversations in therapy continued, a question slowly began to appear. What if the quiet she was feeling wasn't random? What if it was the result of something her mind had learned to do? Something that once helped her continue functioning during a difficult time, but had quietly remained in place long after that period ended. And if that was true, then the story of her emotional distance might not begin in the present at all. It might begin several years earlier, during a time when life had required something very different from her. Part 4. A period of life that required holding everything together. A few years before Anna came to therapy, her life had entered a period that required an unusual amount of strength. Nothing catastrophic happened. There was no single dramatic event that changed everything overnight. Instead, several challenges appeared at the same time. Family difficulties began to demand more attention. Certain relationships required emotional energy. Unexpected responsibilities slowly accumulated. At the same time, her professional life became more demanding. Deadlines increased. Expectations became higher. Decisions carried greater consequences. Individually, none of these situations seemed impossible to handle. But together, they created a long stretch of time where life required constant stability. Someone had to remain calm. Someone had to organize solutions. Someone had to make sure everything continued functioning. And gradually, Anna became that person. She didn't choose the role intentionally. It simply happened. In moments when others felt overwhelmed, she stayed steady. When people around her felt stressed or uncertain, she focused on practical solutions. She became the reliable one, the person others trusted to keep things moving forward. Friends and family began relying on her calmness. Her ability to remain composed during difficult moments made people feel safer. At work, the same pattern appeared. And when situations became complicated, she stepped in. She solved problems, she handled pressure, she made sure responsibilities were completed. From the outside, this looked impressive, and in many ways, it truly was. She managed an enormous amount of responsibility without collapsing under the pressure. But what most people around her didn't notice was how she was able to do it. Because remaining stable during long periods of stress usually requires something important: emotional control. During that time in her life, Anna learned to regulate her emotional reactions very carefully. When frustration appeared, she pushed it aside. When exhaustion built up, she kept moving. When difficult feelings surfaced, she focused on solving the situation instead of exploring the emotion. At first, this approach made perfect sense, and the situations around her required action, not reflection. People needed support. Problems need solutions. So she did what many capable people do during demanding periods. She placed her own emotional reactions in the background. Not forever, just long enough to keep everything functioning. And for a while, this strategy worked remarkably well. She stayed productive. She stayed dependable. She stayed calm. The people around her appreciated her stability. They saw her as strong, resilient, reliable. But what they couldn't see was the quiet effort required to maintain that level of control. Because every time an emotion was pushed aside, the mind learned something. It was learned that reducing emotional intensity helped maintain stability. It was learned that lowering emotional reactions allowed her to keep functioning under pressure. And then over time, that pattern became automatic. Not because she consciously decided it should, but because her nervous system had discovered an efficient way to handle stress. Lower the emotional volume, stay focused, keep moving forward. For months, and eventually years, that system continued operating, and during the difficult period in her life, it served an important purpose. It protected her ability to function. It allowed her to remain the stable person others depended on. But once that system learns how to reduce emotional intensity, it doesn't always know when to stop. Part 5. Why her system didn't turn the emotions back on. One of the most fascinating things about the human nervous system is how quickly it adapts. When the brain discovers a strategy that helps maintain stability, and it often continues using that strategy automatically, even after the original situation has changed. Anna had spent a long time operating in a very specific emotional mode. During the demanding years of her life, she had learned to reduce emotional intensity to stay functional. Do not eliminate it, just lower it enough to remain steady. That pattern worked extremely well during the difficult period she experienced. By keeping emotional reactions smaller, she was able to think clearly. She could solve problems. She could support others without becoming overwhelmed herself. Her mind had essentially discovered a protective setting. Lower emotional amplitude, maintain stability, continue functioning. But the nervous system does not always distinguish between temporary strategies and permanent ones. When a pattern is used long enough, it begins to feel normal. The brain assumes that the same settings should remain active, even when the circumstances that required them have disappeared. By the time Anna's life became calmer again, her emotional system had already adjusted to a quieter mode. Her brain had learned that reduced emotional intensity was the safest way to operate, so it simply continued doing the same thing. Not because she was still under pressure, not because danger was still present, but because the system had grown accustomed to functioning that way. This is something psychologists observe quite often. People adapt to survive difficult periods. They develop strategies that help them remain stable during stress. But when life becomes calmer again, those same strategies sometimes remain active. And like a security system that continues operating even after the threat is gone. Anna's mind had spent years protecting her from emotional overload, and it had become very good at it. So good, in fact, that it continued lowering emotional intensity even when the stressful chapter of her life had already passed. That is why the feeling she described was not dramatic. It wasn't emptiness. It wasn't despair. It was simply quieter. Her system had learned to reduce emotional volume, and it had forgotten how to raise it again, at least for the moment. But eventually, something happened that helped her notice the real cost of that quietness, a moment so ordinary that it might have passed unnoticed, except for one small realization that changed how she understood everything. Part 6. The moment she recognized the cost. The realization didn't come during a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly. During a simple evening with friends, Anna had been invited to a celebration for someone she cared about deeply. It was one of those gatherings where the atmosphere feels warm the moment you walk into the room. People were talking over each other. Music played softly in the background. Laughter appeared easily, moving from one corner of the room to another. Everyone seemed excited. Stories were being shared. Memories were being revisited. At one point, someone raised a glass and spoke about how important this friendship had been over the years. The words were sincere, emotional. A few people around the table even became visibly moved. Anna listened carefully. She understood every word. She knew exactly why the moment mattered. She knew how much she cared about the person being celebrated. But as she sat there, she noticed something strange. The emotion she expected to feel wasn't arriving. It wasn't completely absent, but it felt distant, muted, like the feeling was trying to reach her, but stopping somewhere along the way. She smiled. She participated in the moment, but inside, something felt slightly disconnected, and for the first time she realized something important. The same mechanism that had once protected her from emotional overwhelm was now affecting something else. It wasn't only reducing stress, it was reducing joy as well. That quiet emotional distance was no longer simply a protective strategy. It had become a limitation. At part 7, Relearning how to feel without being flooded. The work that followed wasn't about forcing emotions to appear. In fact, trying to force feelings often creates even more distance. Instead, the process was much gentler. It involved slowly allowing more space for emotional experiences to return. Paying attention to small reactions, not rushing past them. Allowing moments to stay a little longer. A piece of music, a meaningful conversation, a memory that suddenly appears during a quiet moment. Instead of moving quickly to the next task, Anna practiced letting those experiences linger. At first, this felt unfamiliar. Her system had spent years minimizing emotional intensity, so allowing emotions to stay required patience. But slowly, something began to shift. Small reactions became slightly stronger, and moments felt a little more vivid, not dramatically, not all at once, gradually, like color slowly returning to an image that had once faded. Months later, Anna said something simple during a session. I didn't realize how quiet everything had become. And that realization captured something important about emotional numbing. Some people don't stop feeling cold because they are cold. They stop feeling because for a long time, feeling less was the only way to keep moving forward. The mind protected them in the best way it knew how, by lowering the volume. Healing in this situation is not about returning to emotional chaos. It's not about becoming overwhelmed again. It's about rediscovering balance, learning that emotions can exist without taking everything over, and when slowly remembering that life becomes richer when the full range of feeling is allowed to return.